Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to our second webinar in a series of webinars that we are this year and into next year. I'll just give James a quick introduction and then James is going to get on with his presentation. So James has worked for Froglife for 9 years. During this time, James has done a sterling job on building and restoring an estimated 113 large-scale freshwater habitats alongside hundreds of smaller water bodies. So James is certainly very well placed to give this webinar on creating the perfect wildlife pond. Over to you, James.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathy. I'm just going to get my screen sharing and then have that started. Right, so welcome along everybody then. I'm hoping that you can all see and hear this okay. So this is our webinar today on the perfect wildlife pond, how to make one and how to maintain it. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be going through today and the actual content of the webinar, our largest section today will be on how to actually create a wildlife pond and things to actually think about before creating them and to get that perfect pond as best as we can. We've got some case studies throughout the webinar as well. These are on pond creations, both large and small. And then later on this evening, we'll do a shorter section on pond management and different things you can do throughout the seasons to keep the pond in the best condition. Right at the end, we'll go through some frequently asked questions as well on ponds. We've got a very short quiz at the end as well to see what you guys learned basically. And then we've got some audience questions. So it's a chance for you guys to ask any questions that have arisen during the webinar, but also some of you have been kind enough to send in some questions beforehand, which we can answer as well. So jumping straight into things, into actually creating a wildlife pond and things that we want to think about to make that perfect wildlife pond. The last thing we want to do is just go in sort of gung-ho, start digging a pond, get halfway through digging a pond and then think, uh-oh, we've got everything wrong. There's a fair bit of planning and design that you want to do first, and this can eliminate a lot of problems down the line. So it's good to take the time at the start to make sure that all the conditions are right and that you've thought about where you're going to put the pond in the garden, in the allotment, in the green space, no matter where it's going to be. So the first thing is choosing a functional location. We want to make sure that our pond is going to have access to sunlight, and we want to make sure our pond isn't going to be too heavily shaded. Some shade is okay, but if it is surrounded heavily by trees and we're getting lots of heavy shading, that won't make for a perfect wildlife pond by any means. On the one hand, a heavily shaded pond means that it's going to be very cold and cooler temperatures. This isn't too good for any developing wildlife in the pond, so our tadpoles and our newt larvae will not be developing very quickly and are far more likely to stay in that larval stage for the autumn and winter in a heavily shaded pond. It also means that we've got the headache of always dealing with leaf litter as well. So of course, we all know trees drop leaves when it comes around to autumn and winter especially, and those leaves have lots of toxins that trees are trying to get rid of as well. So we can end up with lots of nutrients in the pond that we don't want, and then we have to remove all that leaf litter as well. So again, just a bit of a headache for us that we can try to avoid. It's okay to have some shading around the pond, but just make sure it's not too dense. Think as well about things like compost heaps, anything else in the garden that you might have that might be a source of excess nutrients, or things like near to a road and things like this. If we can locate ponds away from sources of nutrients, we can stop lots of problems in the future with the pond, and we'll move on to some of those things a little bit later. Also consider what habitat is already present. For many of us in the garden, we might have clear areas where a pond is quite obviously a good space. For more wilder gardens or nature reserves, green spaces, you don't want to be getting rid of a good habitat for wildlife already to make a pond necessarily. Try to pick areas that aren't doing much for wildlife to begin with. And also think about the surrounds of the pond as well. So we don't want to be placing a pond in an area of very bare grass or short grass and short plants. If we've got longer areas of grass already around and places where amphibians can disperse when they're leaving the pond, then these are all things towards an ideal pond location. Pond sizes. So don't get put off by the size of what a pond can be. Obviously, we've all got gardens of different sizes, and different pond sizes are perfectly fine. The definition of a pond here we can see is a permanent or seasonal water body between 1 meter squared and 2 hectares in surface area, which holds water for 4 or more months of the year. So you can see there's a huge range of different sizes of ponds here, which are going to be good for different types of wildlife. And there's certainly nothing wrong with having a smaller pond. This is particularly good for the common frog. Some of us might know already when we've seen things like frog spawn and frogs breeding, then they're not too fussy. They're quite happy in smaller, shallower waters. So if you are looking towards encouraging frogs in particular, then smaller ponds can be a really good idea. The only thing to think about with your pond size as well is if we can have a slightly larger pond, it does allow us to have a bit more of depth in the pond. And we'll move on to why that's important very shortly. Think about the pond shape as well before you start digging anything out. We want this to be a natural, irregular pond shape, a random pond shape, something that we'd find normally in nature. This creates a larger circumference of the pond and more edge habitat, which means that we'll have lots of shallow areas, which are really, really important for our pond wildlife. The main things you want to avoid are any kind of man-made or human-made shapes where we have squares, rectangles, perfect circles, things like that. It sounds really simple, but it can actually be quite hard to be random when you're designing and digging out a pond and marking it out. So it is good to mark out this irregular pond shape to begin with as you get things going. So moving back onto the pond depth as well. So many of us might not be aware that the top 10 centimeters of water depth is where we find the most biodiversity in a pond. These shallow areas are incredibly important for both our wildlife and our plants as well. So what we call this is the drawdown zone of the pond. So these shallow areas will be wet in some seasons and dry in other seasons as well. They'll also be warmer than the deeper areas of water. So you may have seen lots of tadpoles around pond edges. That warmer water allows them to develop quicker, which is what they want to do to go through metamorphosis. The pond depth will depend on the size, so it's hard to say exactly what the pond depth should be. If you've got a smaller pond, it might not be as deep. A larger pond, you can have more depth. If you are able, though, to go to about 60 centimeters at least in your pond, then that's fantastic, as long as it's safe to actually dig to that level for a smaller pond. What this means is if we can have at least 60 centimeters of pond depth, it's really useful in the winter. We don't want the pond to freeze over entirely. Some common frog males in particular will use the bottom of the pond to shut down over the colder months of the year and overwinter in there. So if we have a bit of pond depth down there, it's less likely to freeze completely. So at least 60 centimeters is great. A bit more can be good as well. That deep zone in the pond, though, doesn't need to be a very wide or big zone at all. You can just have a small, deeper area of the pond that's going to be useful for the winter. Otherwise, not an awful lot of pond wildlife is going to use those deeper areas. A really important one to think about when designing our wildlife pond as well is the slope. We want to look towards gently sloping edges, and these are absolutely essential for wildlife in general. So you imagine tiny little froglets and toadlets trying to get out of the pond need these gently sloping edges to do that safely. Other forms of wildlife, small mammals such as hedgehogs in particular, will also make use of this if they happen to fall into the pond. The last thing we want is to create a pond where wildlife could drown or be in danger. So remember these gently sloping edges. That also gives us those shallow zones of the pond that we desire as well. And it's also good for people. We don't want people who are going to end up, hip height of water going up them if they fall into a pond. So we want to make sure we have these gradual slopes into the pond that are safe for wildlife and people. You've got some illustrations here, some very crude illustrations of what this might look like, but something towards a 1:4 ratio or 1:3 ratio is ideal, in my experience at least, to have this nicely, gently sloping edges to your perfect wildlife pond. Another thing that some of us might be thinking about is how many ponds to have. Now, fair enough, if you do have a smaller garden and you can only get a small pond in there, then that's fantastic. That's a great thing to do. But if possible, it is good to create a pond network if you do have a slightly larger garden. And the main thing to take away from this particular point is that if you are thinking about having one large pond in your garden, think again and think more about having maybe two small ponds, a medium-sized pond and a small pond. There's so many benefits to creating a little pond network, even if it is just within a medium-sized or large garden space. What this means if we have maybe 2 ponds or 3 ponds is that they're all going to be different sizes, shapes, and depths as well. Different forms of wildlife and plants within the pond will really benefit from all of these different variations. So a pond network is really good. It also means that we have a more robust set of ponds. If we do, for example, have maybe 2 or 3 ponds and they happen to be lined, and one of those, the pond liner fails, it's vandalized, anything that happens to it, then we've still got maybe 1 or 2 of the ponds that are perfectly functional for our amphibians and other wildlife as well. So always think about, can you add in a couple more ponds, even if they're quite small, into your space to make this pond network? A key question can be about pond liners as well. We'll go through the pond lining process a little bit later on. But the first thing we want to think about, again, before doing any digging and in the design sort of stage and phase, is whether we're going to use pond liners or not. And this all depends on the soil type that you have. By and large, if you have clay-based soils, these will hold water throughout most of the seasons and you wouldn't need a pond liner. If you have more free draining soils, then obviously pond liners are almost essential. In many times for garden settings, we do have to use pond liners. There's not too many gardens that flood throughout autumn, winter, into the spring and summer as well. But depending on the soil type that you have, it might be something to consider as well. By and large, if you're digging up any of the soil and you roll some of the soil into a ball in your hand, if it stays as a ball, that's more clay-based. If it tends to just crumble away, then it's not clay-based. It's more of a free draining soil. So that's one way that you can tell. Obviously, if this is your own garden, unless you happen to have just moved in there, you'll probably have some ideas on how does it flood? Does it flood? Does it flood throughout certain seasons? You can use your own knowledge as well in terms of whether to use a pond liner or not. If you're really not sure, or this is more on a grander scale, you can use something called a trial hole as well. So this is the pictures that you can see in the bottom of the screen here and the different stages of digging these. So for these, we use what's called a trenching spade. It's a kind of narrow, kind of long spade that lets you go down a bit further, or a bit easier at least. And we'll dig down to the depth of our pond and then see what the soil is like down there. You'll find in some gardens and green spaces that the soil at the top is not the same as the soil lower down. So it can be a good way to start investigations that way. We'd then leave that to fill with rainwater and we'd monitor what that rainwater does. Does the rainwater sit and hold and then drain away? Does it drain away immediately? Or does it sit and hold indefinitely? In which case you probably have very good clay-based soils, and that is going to hold the water throughout most of the seasons in a normal year. If you are digging a trial hole though, think about health and safety again. You'll see this one has a little exit ramp. So if anything like a hedgehog or any amphibians have fallen down there, they've got a way out, because we don't want to create anything that's hazardous to them, and make sure that people aren't going to fall down it too. Within your own garden setting, you're probably fairly safe with that, but always mark it out with signs just in case. We also want to think about the creation method. So if we are thinking of small or medium-sized ponds, we might just be using hand tools. So using spades is an obvious one. Mattocks can be very useful as well. You have to make sure you do use them safely, of course. They can be a bit dangerous, but they're very good for breaking up rocks, gravel, things like this. So you might use a combination of both mattocks and spades in order to actually create a pond. Or you could use mechanical means as well. So you'll see in the bottom right there is a tracked excavator. It's very unlikely that many of you will use a machine of this size, but it's not impossible in a garden setting that you might be using something like a 1.5 ton mini digger, a sit-on mini digger. Things like this can be used in gardens as well to create ponds. It all depends on what you want to do, your abilities, and also how many ponds and what kind of pond size you want to go for. It doesn't really matter too much though in terms of the principles of creating a pond. That digger that you can see on the bottom right there is just like a really big mechanical spade. There's no different principles at all. We'll see in the case studies later that whether you're using a small spade or a big digger, It's all the same things that you need to consider in the design of your pond. So we can create the best pond in the universe, and we can create a pond that's really good for wildlife and would have lots of frogs and toads and newts in it, and is absolutely perfect and follow all the guidelines. We've got to think about connectivity though, because if that pond happens to be completely cut off from the outside world, it's not going to have an awful lot in it apart from maybe aquatic invertebrates. So think about habitat connectivity in your garden setting. Now, it can be tricky with neighbors. You can't obviously tell them what to do, but if we can look more towards what we've got on the left here, obviously it's a picture of farmland, but the main thing to take away from that is hedgerows. Hedgerows are fantastic for allowing wildlife to pass through and get about from place to place as they need to. If you haven't got the option of having hedgerows and you already have fences, then you can put gaps in fences, again, allowing amphibians and other mammals, for example, to get from place to place around gardens, and try to encourage neighbors to do so as well if you feel that your neighborhood is particularly cut off. So what we want to avoid is what we can see where the big red X is on the slide here, where we've potentially got a garden which is incredibly cut off with no way for amphibians to get in and out. So think about habitat connectivity too. One other thing that isn't essential by any means, but can just be quite interesting, is to look at what species of amphibians are actually around. So you can use something called the National Biodiversity Network for this, and look at species records by entering your postcode, and it gives you an idea of what wildlife is around. And that might even cater or tailor into the design of your ponds in particular. So you can see all kinds of different species of wildlife, see the amphibians, and give you an idea of, okay, I have only toads nearby, I might be looking more towards creating ponds for toads. Conversely though, if you want to encourage amphibians which aren't coming up, then you might go against that. Just gives you a bit of an idea. The records that are listed here are by no means exhaustive, but it just gives you an idea of what amphibians may occur locally if you haven't been lucky enough to spot any in the time that you've been at your particular garden or green space. Another thing to consider is when to actually create a pond. So presuming that for many of us, this is in a garden setting and the vast majority of us are using hand tools to actually create a pond, pretty much any time of the year is okay. You need to be aware, obviously, during the spring and summer of amphibians and other forms of wildlife being active. So we don't want to harm or disturb them. But if it's just ourselves using hand tools, obviously that's not a huge amount of disturbance as long as we're aware of that. Be particularly careful, maybe in mid to late summer, you could have huge numbers of amphibian larvae and metamorphosed larvae on the land as well. So do be careful of any froglets, toadlets, things like this as well that could be present. If we happen to be using more sort of hardcore methods, so we're using tracked excavators, mini diggers, things like this, then autumn and winter is more the time we want to create the pond, because using that larger machinery could cause harm and damage to the wildlife during their active season. But for hand tools, you can get away with most times of the year. One thing that I can quite often, to be honest, forget about until I'm halfway through a job is that obviously you're going to be excavating this pond. You might be excavating several ponds. You might be excavating several large ponds. Remember that what you're digging up has to go somewhere as well. And again, thinking about this early rather than when you're already actually digging the pond up is really, really crucial. So make sure the spoil, which is what we call the soil that we've excavated up from the pond, has somewhere to go, and preferably somewhere close by as well. If it needs to go to the other end of a big garden or something like that, you could spend 75% of your effort and time actually just moving the soil from place to place than actually digging your pond. So think about that early and make sure that's taken into consideration. There's also a couple of things that you can do with the spoil from your pond, again, to be aware of when you're actually digging it out. The subsoil, or the soil that we get from the deeper part of our excavation, is particularly low in nutrients, and that can be useful for a couple of things that we're going to talk about later in terms of management, and also if we're using pond liners. So in that respect, in that regard, you might want to keep some of that subsoil in a separate tub or container because it might come in handy later. Also creating things like hibernacula, you can use soil and spoil for that as well. Hibernacula is just a really fancy term for basically dead wood piles, logwood piles, which are particularly useful for amphibians, reptiles, other form of wildlife in those cold, winter months as well. So keeping some of that aside and using it for other beneficial means for wildlife can be a good idea to plan out. Think about your pond surroundings as well. And this might be, again, something to think about early. We want to make sure we've got lots of cover nearby to ponds. The last thing we want is for our frogs, toads, and newts to be emerging from a pond into very shortcut grass and then potentially being picked off by predators, birds, cats, things like this. So pond surroundings, very important to have at least some longer areas of grass and plants as well. So they've got that cover, they can shelter from predators, get away from the pond when they actually need to, and also if it's particularly hot times of the year as well. It might surprise some of you to learn that amphibians spend 2/3 of their lives on land rather than in the water. Obviously, ponds are vital for their breeding success and a vital part of their life cycle every single year, but they do spend more time on land than water. So we need to consider that to a degree as well, and that being connecting to our pond. And the other picture here is a picture of a hybernacular, again, just a fancy term for dead wood piles, lots of stick stones, bricks, rocks, things like that, that we can top over with some of that spoil too. A very important one to take away from today is water source for ponds as well. So it depends a little bit where you are in the UK for this. I'm not going to know the answer for all of you for this. Up in the north of England and Scotland, where I'm located, we can pretty much create ponds and there's no worry. As long as we've got the soil type and whether we've used a liner or not, rainwater is on the way and will top up and fill the ponds. If you're towards the Midlands or south of England, this could be more of a concern. So again, thinking about this early when you design the location and design the pond is really important. We want to make sure we're always using rainwater and never tap water. Tap water has chemicals which are harmful for the pond and for the wildlife and the water quality of the pond as well. So don't be tempted to do the kind of quick fix, use tap water. You have to be patient and use rainwater. If that is going to be particularly tricky, if you are in a drier area of the UK, think about collecting rainwater in water butts like we can see on the left here. You might want to go a step further as well if it is really dry and think about having drainage systems on sheds, outhouses, other areas where you can collect that rainwater in the rainwater butt so it's then ready to use for the pond, either to fill it up or to top it up in later seasons. Again though, thinking about where the pond's going to be located. If you do have your rainwater collection system at one end of the garden and you locate the pond at the other end of the garden, it's going to be very difficult to lift up 100 litres of rainwater on a consistent basis to fill up that pond. So think early, can I have my rainwater collecting near to the pond, save myself some massive headaches in the future. And just some other pond problems to be aware of as well. Some of these might be relevant, some of them maybe not so much. Dogs are a particular problem for ponds. They'll tend to run into ponds, really cause them to silt up at a quicker rate than they would normally. And they'll also trample all the lovely plants that we need for cover around ponds for amphibians when they're exiting the ponds as well. So that can be a major problem. If you are going to have major problems with dogs, then you might need to think about fencing around the pond so it is protected, and that can cause huge differences on whether you end up with a good or a bad pond. For larger ponds and larger gardens, again, you might be thinking about wildfowl, so ducks, geese, swans, things like this. They can be having some negative effects to our ponds, so they can defecate in the water, increasing nutrient levels. They may eat things like frog spawn, for example, and they'll certainly eat submerged, aquatic and marginal plants, again, that are vital for most of our amphibians at some point in their life cycle. A few ducks and geese, if you tend to get them in your garden, if you're lucky enough to do that, is perfectly fine. We just need to be aware if we're going to have huge numbers. Fish is also a big problem for our ponds as well. So obviously lots of people like to see fish in their ponds. If that's the case, it's very unlikely that we're going to have successful populations of frogs and newts. They will be predated upon by the fish, unfortunately. Toads, not so much. They produce a natural toxin, even at the larval stage, that makes them distasteful to many predators, including fish. So they're okay, but if you are looking towards frog or newt ponds, then fish is not a route that you would want to go down. Of course, if you really got your heart set on having a fish pond as well, then go back a few slides and look at having the idea of a pond network. You could have a couple of ponds for wildlife and amphibians and one for fish, or one for either way. And one last thing in terms of pond problems can be protected species as well. fairly unlikely in our garden settings, but always good to be aware that we're not breaking any rules or any of the laws, and making sure that if there are protected species there, that we're not going to harm or disturb them in our creation method as well. So I'll start off with a couple of short case studies here. We've got some videos on how to create unlined ponds. It will give you a chance to see everything we've talked about basically in terms of pond shape and design. These are done with large excavators, but again, don't get too hung up on that. It is just a big spade, basically. The same techniques that are used here, you will use, but just on a smaller scale with a spade. So a couple of quick case studies here before we move on to our next section. Okay, so that's a couple of our first case studies there. So that's mainly all about unlined ponds. We haven't moved on to pond liners too much, apart from deciding whether to use one or not. So we'll go into a bit more depth on pond liners now. So the first thing to maybe point out is that only use a pond liner if it is needed. In garden settings, like I say, most of the times it is going to be needed. The last thing we want to do though is try and put a pond liner into a place which is flooded on quite a constant basis. What you'll end up there is with a pond liner floating towards the surface with the water underneath building up pressure, and that's no good at all, a massive waste of time, effort and money. But if we do need to use a pond liner, there's lots of different types that we can use. So I'm going to run through some of the more common ones here and just give you a few options basically. So PVC pond liners, the polyvinyl chloride liners, these are the cheaper ones that you'll tend to see in most garden centers and garden center settings. They're not really that strong. They are the cheaper option. If that's what your budget allows, then by all means, you can go for these pond liners, but you will have a bit of trouble with installing them and also the durability of a PVC liner. We've also got butyl liners as well. So that's a synthetic rubber liner. They're a lot more expensive and a lot stronger. Ones that we tend to use up in our Scotland projects are EPDM liners, so ethylene, propylene, diene, monomer rubber liners. These are very easy to install because they are quite flexible. They're durable in the weather as well and ultraviolet resistant as well. So that means they're basically protected from sunlight. They're not going to go brittle over time through exposure to the sunlight. Flexible and strong and relatively cost effective if you've got a bit of budget for your pond liner type. On average, you're going to get about 20 years at least out of an EPDM liner and a pond that is lined with this material. If you do follow a couple of steps I'm going to move on to on the next slide, however, you could get many, many more years out of an EPDM liner than that. We also have polyethylene liners. So these are a plastic liner. They come in different density types, so low, medium and high density types as well, which obviously the prices are different for each of those. It's not quite as strong as the rubber liners that we tend to look at, and it's certainly less flexible than EPDM is, and installation is okay. It's somewhere in the middle there in terms of ease. It's a slightly cheaper option, but it certainly is a good option if you are on a slightly tighter budget, and relatively durable. So if you are using the method I'm going to explain in a minute in terms of protecting a liner from top and bottom, polyethylene liners might give you something like 36 years in terms of the duration of the pond. Obviously, things can change. Two last options there, which you're unlikely to use, but just to explain them, are geosynthetic clay liners as well. These are sodium bentonite crystals sandwiched between layers of geotextile fleece. They're not very useful in a garden setting, in my personal opinion. These are more used for small lakes, large ponds and small lakes, things like that. So yeah, not something you would use on sort of small to medium-sized ponds in the garden. And also puddled clay. So puddled clay is your kind of old school approach to actually lining a pond. It's very unlikely, though, that you're going to have someone with a truckload of puddled clay that they can bring around to your garden. So again, not something that I'm going to explain too much, but it is technically an option if you can get hold of it. We want to make sure that our pond liner is actually protected, though. So what we want to use when we're installing a pond liner is underlay. So there's three different options that exist in terms of what you can use for underlay. So you can use sand, so you spread this across the base of the area that you've excavated, and that protects the pond liner. Alternatively, you can use a geotextile fleece. This is often sold at places that you will get pond liners from. And you can also use old carpet as well. There's just a few points to say about old carpet and using that as a form of underlay to protect the pond liner is make sure it is a man-made fiber, such as polypropylene, something like that. If you do have a natural fabric of carpet, such as wool, this will rot down over time and then expose the liner to potential damage. So you want to avoid things like that. Also, old carpets, depending on where you get them from, can have things like staples and tacks in. The last thing we want to do is actually puncture our pond liner with the thing that's meant to protect it. So make sure those are removed or cut off before you use any old carpet. If we do end up puncturing the liner, of course, it's really difficult to actually repair them. And so it is a chance of being game over at that stage. So we don't want that to happen. So we want to keep anything sharp away from them. Some people, and the method I'm going to describe very shortly, might use an overlay as well as an underlay. So again, this would be the same material that you use underneath the pond, we would use on top of the pond, such as a geotextile fleece or old carpet. So these are the 6 relatively simple steps in how to install a pond liner. So the first thing you want to do is obviously excavate the area. You've gone through the stages of thinking about where the pond's going to be, how many ponds you're going to have. You've gone through all those design stages already. We can then excavate the area, and we want to make sure if we are installing a pond liner that we also include a trench. So this is going to be around the perimeter of the pond, about 30 centimeters from the outside. And it just means that when we put in the underlay, the pond liner, it's something that we can tuck those all into. So it acts as an anchor trench, and then we fill that in later. It doesn't need to be too deep, just enough so you can get some material in there. Really important step at stage 2 here is to clear that pond base and get it as smooth as possible. So remove things like roots, twigs, stones, sharp objects, glass, anything else that you happen to find down there in your garden or green space setting. Really make sure there's nothing there that's going to puncture that liner. Even if you are using underlays, things can still get through. Make sure it's as smooth as possible. We'll then lay down our underlay, so it could be sand, geotextile, old carpet, lay that down across the entire excavated base of the pond that we've got, and then secure that in the trench. And then we'll lay down the liner of choice that we've gone for as well and secure that in the trench too. Now at this stage, you could be done with pond creation. You could leave it there. You would have a relatively nice pond that you could just let fill with rainwater and no worries. The only problem is that it will be quite unsightly. So you will have lots of exposed liner, and it is nigh on impossible to cover up that liner at this stage without taking a couple of extra steps. If you do take a couple of extra steps as well, you're more likely to have a pond that will last for longer. So I would say, if you can do, costs a little bit more and a bit more time and effort, go to step 5 as well, and we'll lay down some geotextile overlay or old carpet on top as well, giving the liner protection on the bottom and the top, and then we'll cover that with some subsoil. Remember before we said we would keep some of the low nutrient subsoil found at the deeper areas of excavation. We'll put that back on top, just a few centimeters covering, for a natural finish. What this means for our pond then is that we have a pond that if we had visitors around and someone saw it, they wouldn't even know that a liner has been used or installed in any way. They'd have no idea at all, which is great, really good aesthetics. It also means we've got a nice natural substrate as well. So that's good for plants, also good for aquatic invertebrates laying eggs, and just creates this really nice natural finish if we can go that extra mile with our pond creation. In terms of pond liner calculators, I don't need to go into this in too much detail. There's loads of online calculators that you can use to work out how much pond liner you need. You can just search for those quite easily. Basically, you need to know the length, width, and depth of the pond that you're going to create. Pop that in there. The equation is written there as well if anybody does want to do the sort of maths of it all. And then that 30 centimeters extra is what we talked about with the trench as well. So we've got enough material to tuck into that trench and anchor our materials in for the long term. Just a little tip as well, if you're unsure if sizes are kind of neither one way or the other with what you can get hold of, always better to have a bit more pond liner and a bit more underlay and overlay rather than a bit less. It's really easy to cut a bit off the end, not so easy to magically create some new. So make sure you go a little bit over if you're not quite sure. Right, so we've got a series of 4 case studies here, which are more towards lined ponds. Again, 2 of them are going to be excavated with their machinery and 2 are in more garden settings, but really take note of the way that we've done the liner and the liner's been installed in all of them, and that should give you the process a lot better than maybe I can do via text, but you'll be able to see that happen step by step. So I'll start these off.
Take me straight to laptop. Nice one. Never.
And just so you can see as well how those two ponds eventually ended up once it had a bit of rainwater at some time to establish as well. So our next case study here is in a garden setting involving a line pond. So we've gone over an awful lot of different ideas on different tips on how to create ponds there, whether they be unlined or lined in different sizes and shapes as well. So there's a final little video and case study here, which really rounds up all these different pond creation tips in case you've missed any. Okay, so just to round off creating a wildlife pond then, just remember the advantage of clean pond water. Ponds that have good clean pond water and that are made in the right way require very little management and don't cause too many headaches. So it's a really important thing to think about. We don't have to keep managing ponds all the time if we get it right initially. They also have higher biodiversity, a longer lifespan, as I say, few problems in the long term as well. One other thing to be aware of, particularly for garden settings, are mini ponds. So if you do have a very small space, maybe a limited budget, these are fantastic, or where areas or where safety is a concern in the area as well. So you might have children, vulnerable adults, things like this. So these raised ponds or mini ponds can be used with a washing up tub, maybe a tub truck like you can see in the pictures here. They can either be placed on the ground, allowed to fill with rainwater, build an embankment so things can get in, and then put some stones or rocks so things can get easily out as well. Or you can dig them into the ground to whatever size or shape they are. And again, just make sure there's a few stones and rocks in there so things can easily get out and nothing's going to drown, including our amphibians, once they want to leave the water. They can also be a really good accompaniment to a larger pond as well. So if you are putting in a pond into your garden, maybe think about having 1 or 2 little mini ponds nearby, and just like that, you've got your pond network as well. Really easy to do and very cheap as well. So always a good little accompaniment. So we'll now think about what to do in terms of actually managing your pond for wildlife, and a few different things that you can do in each of the seasons to keep it up to sort of top notch. You don't have to do all of these every single year by any means. Whenever you're creating a pond, managing a pond, you want to do things step by step and try to keep things in balance. So there's just a few ideas in terms of recommended practices per season here. So in the spring is an obviously good time to plant up the pond with new pond plants. There'll be lots of amphibians active at that time, so it's a relatively harm-free activity to do that can be really good for these populations. It's also an excellent time to monitor the pond for any amphibian sightings. You can use our Dragon Finder app, which is free to download on the Google Play Store and the Apple Store as well for smartphones. And then you can submit any sightings to Froglife of any amphibians that you've seen in your pond. As we head round to summer, it's not the best time to do an awful lot of management in the pond. Larvae for amphibians is particularly delicate, so most management at this time would cause them some harm. Some unwanted plants might need some management in the summer if they tend to die back really quickly in late summer. But if you are doing any kind of plant management at all, be incredibly careful and take extreme care not to harm any small creatures. It is an excellent opportunity, though, to improve the surrounding habitat with high vernacular, deadwood piles, log piles, things like this, if done carefully with amphibian movements in mind. We can look towards topping up the water as well in the pond if we want to, but only using rainwater. As we come round to autumn, this is a great time to thin out plants and remove unwanted, dominant, invasive, or non-native plants that might have made their way into our already established pond. Take care removing any invasive non-native plants as well, that you don't cause them to spread throughout the locality by accident. This can be an illegal activity as well, so always check with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. On their website, they'll have lots of fact sheets on invasive non-native plants and also how to deal with them with each species in the correct way and remove them properly. Remember that amphibian larvae can still be present in the autumn, particularly in cooler climates as well, but this is generally the time to clean or clear the pond if it's required that year and do things such as removing some leaf litter. And as we move around into winter, there might not be too much to do depending on what the winter is like at that season. If it's pictures like we can see here, where it's particularly a harsh or cold winter, and really importantly, if it's safe to do so, you can try to clear some of the snow off the ice on top of a frozen pond. This will allow some light to get through to plants which are in the pond, allow them to photosynthesize and produce low levels of oxygen that are vital for any amphibians or other wildlife that are spending the winter in that pond, amphibian larvae as well. But only do that if it is safe to do so. You don't want to end up falling into a frozen pond. Desilting can be undertaken in the winter or in the autumn as well, as long as it's not frozen over, of course. But again, be very aware of overwintering wildlife at this time that might still be in the pond and have an idea of what to do with that if it is encountered. Also be aware in the winter of any early breeding wildlife as well. So particularly for common frogs, we might start to see sightings of them in January or even earlier in some cases, depending on where you are in the UK. Pond planting is another thing that we can do for our ponds. Now, ideally, if we're going by sort of textbook, a pond should be left to colonize naturally. This is really difficult in garden settings though, so not always something that we want to wait and see over many years if it does eventually happen. In terms of getting hold of plants for our pond in our garden, we can look towards neighbours, but we want to make sure it is very close by. We never want to be taking any plants from further afield than nearby neighbours or areas where we have permission to do so. If we do anything like that, we risk the chance of spreading diseases, which can be absolutely fatal for our amphibian populations, and also spreading invasive and non-native species again. Be aware though, even taking plants from a neighbour, for example, if just one fragment of duckweed is on one of the plants that you get from a neighbour for your pond, that can treble every single day, and basically you can't really get rid of it once you've got it. So do be aware that there are some risks involved in that. Otherwise, look towards certified suppliers that should have a protocol in terms of stopping the spread of diseases, making sure non-natives are not in their stock as well. Use the subsoil or use aquatic compost when you're planting up if you're using things like baskets as well. It's got to be low nutrient soils. Using high nutrient soils or things like topsoil will create bad conditions. And how to plant as well. So again, fairly crude diagram here, but we can use aquatic baskets like this one on this little diagram here, putting our low nutrient subsoil into the bottom with some wash pebbles and planting into that. If we've got a substrate there, if we've got some soil, we can plant straight into that. If it's more submerged or floating plants, we can either throw them in, or if you want to keep them in the center of a pond, you can use a piece of string attached to the bottom of the plant, and the other end you just tie a pebble around, and that gives you a bit of an anchor to then keep them in the middle of a pond. There's lots of different pond plants that you can go for. The main thing is, remember, native plants. Go for native plants to the UK. There's a few examples here though, if you do want a few ideas. So around the sort of like further around the margins and the edges of the pond, we can look towards ragged robin, water mint or cuckoo flower. The sort of wet edges of the ponds, we could look towards marsh marigold or yellow flag iris. Water forget-me-not is another good one, particularly for newts. And then our submerged species as well, actually in the pond. So things like bogbean, starwort is a floating plant as well, and frogbit is the same, that are really good native plants for our pond. Avoid the non-natives though. It can be illegal to put these into a pond and let them spread as well. So avoid them at all costs. Things like water fern, parrot's feather, there's many more that you can look at, and I'll show you where to find those a bit later on. But just make sure we avoid these. We don't want them to spread. And the reason being that our native species, like native plant species, they don't tend to do well with non-native plants. Non-native plants also tend to dominate ponds, create a monoculture in the pond, which isn't very good for wildlife, and we want to keep things in balance. Managing water levels throughout the year as well. So you do want to make sure that you're not going to get too scared about the water level in your pond actually dropping off. So ponds can drop between 30 to 80 centimeters per year, and that's a completely natural occurrence. What we want to avoid is a pond's water level basically not being there in the spring or early summer when our amphibians need it. Some species actually need ponds that do dry out on occasion or go through these quite fluctuating levels. So it's not a thing to necessarily be afraid of. Great crested newts in particular prefer ponds that dry out every few years. So in this instance, if your pond's water level is getting a bit lower, either leave it be and let it do its thing unless it's going to dry out completely, or use our rainwater that we've hopefully got nearby and we can easily top it up. And don't be tempted to use tap water. So our next short section here is on frequently asked questions. So we get lots of questions about ponds. I'm just going to go through some of the basic ones here. Ponds and safety concerns. So whether it's adults, vulnerable adults or children in particular, two options for this when you've got safety concerns. So use the mini ponds that I've already described on the right there. You can also look towards pond grills or rigid meshes as well. You can see this on the left. Two things to be aware of if you're going to use a grill or a mesh. First of all, is the mesh size big enough so that amphibians and other forms of wildlife that want to go in and out of the pond can get through? And also, is it strong enough that someone stands on it? Is it going to withhold someone's weight? If the answer to either of those is no, it's not suitable for the job it's intended for, basically. But you can get some really good meshes and pond grills that don't look too unsightly and can be very useful and create a completely safe pond for sure. Algae is always a problem as well for many ponds and pond owners. Do remember though, algae is a native species, and in low levels, it's not really that bad. It is native. It's also tadpole food as well. But algae tends to build up when there's too many nutrients. So the key thing we want to do is try and stop the source of nutrients. Make sure as well that we plant up the pond and the surrounds of the ponds with native plants. They'll soak up the excess nutrients and not allow the algae to spread out of control. Now, you should expect some algae on new ponds as they're newly colonizing and establishing. Of course, we're going to have either low levels of plants or maybe no plants at first at all. So in that case, you are going to have more nutrients. Don't worry too much at the start if you get a fair bit of algae. If you're going to remove it by hand or with hand tools, do so very carefully because lots of wildlife can get tangled up in it. So be aware of that. And you can also, in combination, use something called barley straw. So barley straw, when placed into the pond, suppresses the growth of the algae without suppressing the growth of other plants that we want to see establish and colonize. It usually takes about a month to actually activate. So you'll place barley straw in the pond in the spring and then remove it either when it turns black or after about 6 months. But all of these actions you'll have to do year on, year out, unless you can actually cut down the amount of nutrients going into the pond and cut down that source of nutrients. Pond drying we've talked about as well, so don't freak out too much if water levels do fluctuate. Top up with rainwater if you've got it and if you feel the need is there. If you do have an unlined pond which fluctuates quite a lot, you could consider deepening it in the autumn when amphibians have left the pond and are out of the way, if possible, so then it stores more water for the spring and summer months. Moving frog spawn, other amphibians and plants. Again, we've discussed this briefly, but it's a definite no-no. We don't want to spread diseases. We don't want to spread non-native species of plants as well. But another thing to consider is you're never going to know if your pond conditions are right, the pond that you've created. Is it good for amphibians? You won't know unless you let amphibians actually get to it themselves, and they will locate water when they need it eventually. So don't be tempted to kind of cheat and take the easy option and move frog spawn in there because your pond might not be suitable. If they get there themselves, you know that you've passed the test. And finally, for frequently asked questions, do I need a pump to have a good pond for wildlife? So we've never had any pumps in our ponds that we've ever had. If you are going to go down the route of having a pump, it does require more maintenance, of course, and you need to make sure that pump is not going to be harmful to the wildlife that hopefully you're trying to benefit by having the pond. So think particularly amphibian larvae and smaller species of wildlife. Is it going to be safe with a pump in there anyway? Okay, so as we start to wrap up here, I've just got a very, hopefully simple and short quiz, just a few questions to see what you've all learned. So I'm not expecting anyone to maybe shout out answers. You can either put them in the chat if you wish, or you can just say them to yourselves. But there's just a few questions here just to kind of consolidate some of the things we've gone over. So the first of which is a multiple choice question, and I'll just give you a few sort of seconds to think which pond shapes are good for a wildlife pond. So if we're going to create a new pond for wildlife in our garden, which of these options might we think are good for wildlife rather than bad? So relatively easy one. Hopefully everyone's had a little time to think about that there. So we want to look for irregular shapes, random shapes, natural shapes we find in the natural environment. So things like B and C here, where they're just completely sort of crazy random shapes, are fantastic. Stay away from doing anything that looks too artificial and manicured, such as answers A and D on there, are not going to be as good for wildlife. And of course, the reason being that we're going to have more edge habitat, more shallow areas with these irregular outlines. So number 2, what is the best time of year to manage unwanted pond plants? So you've got a few different options there. We've just talked about pond management as well. So I'll give you again a few seconds to have a think and make sure you've got a good answer. What is the best time of year to manage unwanted pond plants? So again, hopefully everybody in their own head has come up with answers B or C there. So towards autumn or winter, that is the best time that we want to be managing our pond plants. We haven't got as much wildlife active that we could harm or disturb at that time. If you were going to go for one of the answers, autumn is probably the best time to do it once it starts to cool off a little bit and those plants are still maybe present. As we get into winter, we might not see as many anyway, but it still can be a time to do some management of pond plants that we want to thin out. Number 3, what minimum depth is most suitable for a wildlife pond? So again, I'll give you a bit of time. What minimum depth is most suitable for a wildlife pond? So hopefully everybody remembers fairly early on in our webinar that we're looking at answer D here. For the minimum depth, 60 centimeters is a great one for our wildlife ponds. It is a slightly strange one to answer though, because if we can go more towards 1 meter or 100 centimeters on a bigger pond, that's great. If we are making a mini pond or a really small pond though, we wouldn't want to make it too deep because then it wouldn't be safe. So there's a few answers to this in basic sort of terms, but if we go for D, 60 centimeters, if we've got the space for a pond of that size and it's still safe to do so, that's great. It gives a nice deep zone for overwintering larvae and overwintering common frog males in particular, who might use the bottom of the pond in those colder months. And our final multiple choice question here. So there's 2 diagrams here. Again, they're fairly crude that I've drawn out, that are our garden space. And we're planning and designing where we're going to put our pond, where we're going to place it, so it's going to be the best for wildlife. So which of these 2 pond locations with answer A at the top and answer B at the bottom there is going to be ideal and the best for a wildlife pond? So take into account all the different factors. So hopefully you've had a bit of time to study that there and come to the conclusion that answer B down here is the best for our wildlife pond. I'm just going to use the spotlight here for a second as well. So obviously, if we were to locate the pond over here, out of the main sunlight we get in the garden, it's towards a tree as well, lots of shading, lots of leaf litter, it's right next to the compost, loads of nutrients are going to go in there, and any emerging amphibians are going to be stuck on the short grass as well and are at risk of predation or just not having any cover. Alternatively, we can put the pond down here. It's away from shading, away from nutrients. We've got some sunlight coming in and lots of long areas of grass nearby. So they've got lots of cover when they leave the pond. It all seems incredibly simple, but honestly, it can be difficult when you're actually looking on the ground as to where to put things. It's really easy to make these simple mistakes before you start digging. So the next few questions on our pond quiz are true or false statements. So we'll go with the first one here. Again, you can just answer this to yourselves or put it in the chat if you want to. So a few true or false questions coming up. So it's fine to move my amphibian spawn plants to my new pond from anywhere within the UK. So is that statement true or false? It's fine to move amphibians, spawn or plants to my new pond from anywhere within the UK. And the statement, of course, is false. So we don't want to be moving any amphibians, any frog spawn, toad spawn, anything like this, or plants from anywhere within the UK. If it is a neighbour, if it's within a very small vicinity, then it's okay. Things would spread naturally to that degree, but we don't want to be popping them into a car and taking them miles away. We can spread diseases. We don't know if our ponds are suitable as well, and we can spread non-native plants that can colonise our ponds and other parts of the countryside or other gardens as well, which is all going to be negative for our wildlife in the UK. Next one then, a good pond for wildlife should never dry up. Is that statement true or false? A good pond for wildlife should never dry up. So again, this one is false. We've talked about the fact not to freak out too much if your water levels are drying up a little bit. It's perfectly fine for some ponds to fluctuate from going very wet to being a bit drier, and some ponds on occasion that dry up completely can be great for some species of wildlife and some plants that rely on that as well. Creating multiple smaller ponds is better for wildlife than creating one large pond. Is that statement true or false? Creating multiple smaller ponds is better for wildlife than creating one large pond. So hopefully we've all gone with true on this one. So if we've got the space to make one very large pond, much better to think again and have multiple smaller ponds, 2 medium ponds and a smaller pond, have this robust pond network, different sizes, different shapes, different depths, all good for different species of plants and wildlife as well. So this robust pond network, far better, obviously in larger landscapes and bigger gardens as well, but also going back to the idea of mini ponds, having a medium-sized pond or a small pond and a couple of little tub trugs around. Again, you've got that very small version of a pond network as well. And then our final question on the pond quiz here then. So only lined ponds are useful for wildlife. Is that statement true or false, that only lined ponds are useful for wildlife? So again, hopefully a relatively easy one. It is indeed false. You want to make sure that you've got the best pond for the habitat conditions that you have in your garden or green space. If you need a pond liner, then great, go for it. We want to retain that water throughout the spring and summer seasons. But if you don't need the pond liner, then of course you can still have a fantastic wildlife pond as well. It all depends on doing those initial investigations and making the right choice when you're designing the pond. Okay. So we're going to come around to our questions now. Before you get the chance to ask whatever questions you might have, like I say, some of you were kind enough to actually produce or send over some questions originally. So I'm going to go through a few of those to begin with. So Grace sent in, when is the best time of the year to desilt my pond? So we did talk about this a teeny tiny little bit, but basically to answer the question, autumn or winter is the best time to actually desilt a pond. All the amphibians are going to be out of the way. But do still be aware that you might have overwintering amphibians and larvae as well, and be aware of that if that is the case in your particular pond. If you are desilting the pond as well, to make sure it's cleaned out a little bit, which shouldn't have to be done too often, but every few years, maybe 5 years plus in some ponds, might need to be the case. Try to keep that top layer of silt aside and then replace that afterwards. That top layer of silt that you've got on the pond has lots of aquatic invertebrate eggs, or there's a fair chance it will do at least, and you want that to go back in to keep the whole pond ecosystem in balance and keep those guys around. So if you are desilting the pond, put that top layer of silt into one container, get the bottom layers of silt out of there, or however much you're trying to get out, and do away with that, and then replace that top layer, keeping everything in check and keeping our wildlife very happy. So hopefully that answers that question. So Steve sent in, what is the minimum pond size requirement for great crested newts? So for this one, I did a bit of research actually into the Habitat Suitability Index. You don't need to worry about this at all. This is just for me, but it's basically something that tells us whether a pond is good for great crested newts in particular. When you actually look at this index, it comes up with the minimum sort of score that you would get is for a 7 meter by 7 meter pond. So after doing a bit of sort of maths with it, basically, that's what you'll get to. So if you're looking for great crested newt ponds, something around about 7 meters by 7 meters will be your bare minimum. Great crested newts do have a preference for more medium to larger ponds, though. So the ideal pond size, again, something around 22 meters to 25 meters, more of a medium to large pond size for this species in particular. Great crested newts definitely want an absence of fish. They can't deal with fish predation at all and won't go anywhere near ponds with fish in most of the time. So be aware of that. And like I said earlier, they do actually like ponds that dry up. So ponds that dry up every 1 out of 5 years, 2 out of 10 years, things like this, they're actually more favorable with those types of ponds as well. So Jane had sent in, what plants could I add to give newts or toads a better environment? The pond size in this particular case was a 2.1 by 1.2 meter pond. So what we want to be looking at is that newts desire egg-laying plants. Females will lay their eggs in plants in the pond to protect them, but open water is really important for newts too. The males need clear areas of open water in which to go through display and courtship. So what we want is a balance. We don't want a pond with no plants. We don't want a pond that's all plants. We need a bit of balance for our newts in particular. Toads as well will benefit from the cover and the food source if we can get some good native submerged plants in there. With this being a smaller pond size, I wouldn't say to put all of these in by any means, but I've come up with 5 different plants that you might find beneficial. Maybe you just use 1 or 2 of them in this particular pond size, but if you are looking towards newts, these could be good. So brook lime is one that can be really good. It's planted into wet edges up to 5 centimeters of depth. We can also look towards the more aquatic version of watercress, and this goes up to 10 centimeters of depth, alongside water forget-me-not as well that we saw earlier in one of the photos, really good for female newts when they're laying eggs. And then into deeper zones, we can look more towards water mint or even bog bean as well. And if you have got a smaller pond, you can limit the size of where these plants are established and get to some degree at least with the pot size. So obviously if you use smaller pot sizes and use aquatic pots to actually plant these, you can limit that spread to keep things in check and in balance. Peter had sent in, should you plant up a newly created pond? If so, where would you source the plants? Again, we've kind of gone through this, but just to reiterate some of the points. If you're doing it by the textbook, then no, you shouldn't actually add any plants at all, let it colonize naturally. But in garden settings, enclosed areas, that's really, really tricky to do. So look towards neighbors with gardens or any local areas where you've got permission, but do be aware of any non-native species that you could accidentally spread as well. Otherwise, look at specialist suppliers with protocols in place and make sure to contact them to make sure they're not using, or they've got protocols in place so they're not going to spread non-natives or disease. Caroline has sent in one question about copious blanket weed or algae. Again, just to reiterate the 3 points with that. What's the source of the excess nutrients? Try to remove that excess nutrient source to begin with. You can plant up the pond with plants that are going to soak up those areas or those sources of nutrients as well, which is incredibly useful. You can do some hand removal with rake and a stick, but be careful not to disturb any of the wildlife or harm it, particularly in the spring or early summer months. And you can use barley straw on an annual basis as well. But do remember, algae is native, it's okay in low levels, and new ponds are more likely to have it until established. So again, don't panic too much if you get algae in your brand new wildlife pond. Okay, we don't have an awful lot of time left, but we do have 5 minutes or so if there are any questions from the audience which have come through now. So I think if you can type those into the chat, we might not be able to get around to all of them, but we'll get around to as many as we can do. So if you want to type those into the chat, and then I believe Sheila is going to read some of those out.
Okay, James, we did have a question about ponds drying up. There is a concern about invertebrates. What's the situation there?
So again, I go back to what we've said about ponds drying up, and it is a natural thing that happens. So some species might be not having such a good time with ponds drying up in particular. Other species rely on it though. Some species of plant need those kind of wet to dry conditions. So again, not freaking out too much if ponds are looking a little bit low on the water table and water level. It's more if we are looking towards those ponds in spring, early summer drying up, that's where it's more of a cause for concern. In those instances, top up with rainwater if it is in your garden and you've got access to that. If you don't have access to rainwater, then maybe think about in future seasons having access to that rainwater, setting up drainage and things like that that will collect the rainwater. Otherwise, we can wait until the autumn and then deepen a pond if it's unlined, so then it holds more water in future seasons. Don't get tempted into adding tap water though. Chemicals, not good for the pond water quality. Nothing is going to enjoy that. Lots of nutrients. You're more likely to end up with algal blooms as well. So again, it can be tricky to see at times, but you've got to kind of like let nature take its course. And then if you are going to do anything, rainwater.
Next question, are pond ledges okay for pond plants in baskets rather than sloping edges?
Yep, certainly. So if you are thinking about putting in pond baskets and pond plants in baskets, then ledges can certainly help with that. It's up to you whether you want to have a very gently sloping edge, as we saw that was very smooth on some of the diagrams before, or you want to do it more like ledges. Again, as long as you don't have huge drop-offs or an inability for wildlife to escape from the pond if it needs to get out of the water, that's perfectly fine. I tend to find that even if you do have a bit more of a smooth surface with a substrate or a soil in place on the pond, you can usually actually dig the baskets in a little bit so they sit. But if you have got the pond substrate, then you can just plant directly into that. So it's kind of dealer's choice really in terms of what you want. But shelves and ledges, if you are going to use plant pots, a little bit more easier to manage.
Okay, we've got a suggestion here is using a length of hose pipe from a diverter into the pond to fill up or top up rather than into a water butt. And what about disease if it's actually with you? So there's someone who's got a problem with, there's something that's caused the frog spawn to collapse for the last 2 years. So any ideas what's best to do?
So the first one there with the hose, as long as we're talking about a hose that's taking rainwater from a butt to the pond, no problem at all. If it's a hose taking tap water, then no, don't do that. So it kind of depends on where that's coming from. But yeah, if it's just a system to take the rainwater that you're collecting from one end to the other, then perfectly fine. In terms of diseases, so obviously it's really difficult to determine what diseases could be in a pond. Frogs in particular, as well as all our amphibians, lay a huge amount of eggs. Very few are going to get through to the tadpole stage, then on to juvenile stage, then on to being adults. Lots of things do go wrong genetically and other reasons as well, and it can be difficult to distinguish what diseases there are. The one thing I would suggest doing is looking towards the Garden Wildlife Health, giving them a search on the internet. There's lots of fact sheets of different diseases. They can help you along with a bit of information. There's also the ability to report sightings of diseases as well that you can do through our Dragon Finder app too. So going through that route, either one really should get you some more information. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of our frog spawn in particular won't make it to even tadpole stage. But thankfully, there is an awful lot of it that gets put into ponds. So some of it does make it.
Next question is, are blanket weed controllers that are advertised as safe for wildlife really safe?
So yeah, there's lots of advertisements for putting chemicals in ponds that do this, that, and the other, and don't harm wildlife and all the rest of it. It's a bit of a contentious subject, really. You shouldn't have to do it. You shouldn't have to put any chemicals or anything else into the pond that's sort of unnatural in order to manage these things. Whether they are bad for the water quality, whether they are bad for wildlife, we don't know. We haven't run tests on them. We haven't got the ability to do that. And a lot of the times on the packaging, it's never really stated beyond just bold statements how they've actually tested these things. What I would say is follow the advice that we give you, especially initially, and make sure that you're going through the list of things for algae to get rid of sources of nutrients, plant up ponds, barley straw, things like this first. And it does take a bit of patience with any kind of pond creation and management. You do have to do things step by step and make sure that you're monitoring things as you go. And yeah, just use a bit of patience, and hopefully following those steps, you can get to an end result that's favorable for yourself and the wildlife without having to go through the more artificial chemical route.
And Karina says, I made the mistake of putting tap water in 3 years ago, but have had lots of newts this year. Will it still cause harm, or will rainwater have flush chemicals from it out? I suppose linked to that one is quite a few people do say use tap water, but just leave it in a bucket for a few days for the chemicals to sort of naturally disappear, and what your thoughts on that would be.
So that's really cool if you've had newts in the pond and it was with tap water. Obviously, it's a few years ago, so I'm presuming that there's been a fair bit of rainwater, like you've said yourself, just flushing that system out. So the water quality probably wasn't very good at the start, to be honest with you. But yeah, at this stage, a few years on, with that rainwater going through, and obviously proof is in the pudding as well, the newts are there, so that's okay. So I wouldn't worry about that at this stage. In terms of just leaving tap water out for a few days, yeah, sure, it gets rid of some of the chemicals, but there's chloramines and things in there that will exist for a long time. So again, advice, don't do it. Unless you are leaving it for a long, long time, a few days is not going to have enough of an effect to turn that tap water into a good water quality source for amphibians. Thinking again about their semi-permeable skin and the nature of that, they are particularly susceptible if water quality is not too good. So stick with the sort of, I know it's a slightly harder process, but stick with the rainwater, find ways to collect it, use patience as well. I know it must be harder in drier areas of the UK, but stay away from the tap water for the benefit of the wildlife as well. We've probably got time for like one more at most, Sheila.
Okay, James Dickinson says, what do you think of bog gardens next to the pond?
Yeah, so I only touched on bog gardens a little bit, really. I call them buffer zones, actually. It's to do with the algae, or that's where I actually use them in that instance. Bog gardens are brilliant. If you dig them down, put some boggy plants in there, you tend to replace the soil with some gravel, so it's relatively free draining, and put some old pond liner down there as well. It means you can have some good native marginal plants in there. These are excellent areas. If you can't have a pond, it's a really good habitat. If you have got a pond, it's definitely a good thing to have around. Amphibians can cool off in the summer months in there because it's a nice cool environment. It's also offering them some cover, and importantly, it's excellent for foraging. So lots of insects and vertebrates will be in that bog garden habitat. So if amphibians are around the pond, they've then got this really good place to take a shelter, chill out a little bit, and get some food as well. So yeah, definitely a good thing. So we've got a couple more questions from the audience who'd sent them in previously as well, just to wrap things up. So I think we've just got a few minutes left. Yes, we do. So there were just a final two here that were, when cleaning a pond, what do you not get rid of for wildlife? And that was sent in by Alan. So basically we want our ponds to be in balance. So when we're cleaning out a pond, we want to be getting rid of things like invasive plants, non-native plants that we've talked about, leaf litter as well, but we never want to be decimating the pond by any means, unless it is particularly non-native plants that we're getting rid of. The key is keeping things in a nice balance. Don't allow anything to dominate, because obviously if there's only one type of plant in there, then it might only be one species of wildlife that can actually use it. So having a nice balance of different native plants is what we want, and nice areas of open water in that pond as well, if it is starting to get silted up potentially. And the final one here sent in by Nicola is, how long does it take for wildlife to use a new pond? It's incredibly difficult to say. It depends an awful lot on what is local to your own garden. You might already have frogs, toads, and or newts in the garden before you've even made the pond, so they could be there in 10 minutes potentially. But also what is local in terms of neighbours, locality as well. If you don't have that many amphibians around, it might take a little bit longer. But it comes back to connectivity being the key. So making sure you've got hedgerows where possible, making sure you've got gaps and fences so things can get in and out easily. Our amphibians don't have the benefit that birds have and where they can fly into a garden and off again easily. They need those access routes. Going right back to the start of the webinar as well, you can search for local records on the National Biodiversity Network, just for an idea of what might be around in terms of local records. So the answer to that question really is it could be immediate, but again, you might need to show a bit of patience with the wildlife and the amphibians that are going to come to your pond, and it could be the end of the second year of the pond before you see any amphibians in particular. What you will tend to see though in the first season or so is aquatic invertebrates, and it's a really good journey to see a new wildlife pond where wildlife slowly starts to colonize in until you get this really nice mosaic of different native species. So that's all of our audience questions, and that brings us nicely to the end here. So just a couple of extra points from myself. If anything here hasn't made sense, or you just want to reiterate a few things, or you want something more visual to look at as well, do check out our Just Add Water guide, which is free online. I think the link Ash is going to post in the chat in a moment, but if you search for Just Add Water as well, you'll see Froglife's booklet there. That's all about how to create a wildlife pond from scratch, and also how to manage it. So lots of tips that we've gone through today are all written down there and free for you to obtain. So many thanks for coming along to the webinar. I'm going to hand back to Kathy in just a second. There'll also be an evaluation form that Ash will be emailing to you a little bit later on, but hopefully you've picked up lots of tips there. And I'll now hand you back to Kathy.
Thanks, James, for an absolutely fantastic talk about creating a perfect wildlife pond. I've also learned a lot of new things today, so that's been absolutely brilliant. We've got 2 more webinars coming up in part of our series. So the next one will be wildlife gardening for reptiles on the 12th of October. And then we got one on amphibian ID and ecology on the 11th of January. And we're also looking for ideas from people who have attended our webinars on what other webinars you would like us to host. And then don't forget, you can become a Froglife friend. You can help support this wonderful work that James and other Froglife staff are doing. And if you become a Froglife friend, you don't have to pay the £2 to join these webinars. So if you join 4 webinars, that's £8. Your friendship will cost you £10. Cheaper than going to, I don't know, the cinema. So yeah, you can join us on our donate page, and we really hope to see more of our existing friends and others at future webinars. Thank you very much, and thanks again, James. Fantastic presentation. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.